Hi, welcome to our live stream. I'm here with Dr. Connie,
Hi, everybody.
and we're going to talk about shadow work, the basics of shadow work, what it is, what the shadow is, what the shadow work practice is, and how it is also a social responsibility.
Yeah, so we wanted to explore today our introduction to shadow work. It's a passion for both of us. Keila has wonderful books about it, and I've been writing about it for years. And we're just going to share our expertise and I think go back and forth with our own orientations, our own frameworks, and kind of give you this gift of this beautiful practice.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think the audience would appreciate a brief introduction to shadow work. So, the way that I see the shadow is part of ourselves that we don't want to see, that we don't want to face, the parts that we've rejected, hidden, or disowned because they were judged as unacceptable growing up as a child by our families or the culture that we were raised in or the community that we were around, the environment that we grew up in. And Dr. Connie, you always emphasize this, that the shadow isn't all that we've pushed down that's in the dark. There's also gifts and gold that we've suppressed as well in the shadow, like talents, ideas, and strengths that we haven't owned or harnessed fully in our lives. So, in that's a broad sense of my understanding of shadow work and the work that I've done around that practice of looking within, seeing the parts of yourself that you have ignored or repressed with compassion and honesty. It's a really honest practice. It's hard to be honest one-on-one with people around you, and I feel like that perpetuates the shadow and sinks it deeper. But when you're able to be with yourself and ask yourself questions and answer it independently, that gives you a clear and honest perspective of what's inside.
So, why should we bother with all this inner work? I mean,
Mhm.
what benefits do we gain from shadow work? I think that's really important to start off with because if our anger is hidden and repressed, or our sexuality is hidden, or our sadness is hidden, or our dream of being an artist is buried in the shadow, or our creative self-expression is buried in the shadow, why don't we just live with it and say, that's how we are, and we have this kind of limitation, and then it's okay? Why should we bother with inner work like shadow work? So I want to start with emphasizing the promise of this practice, which is that we can really expand our self-awareness and get to know these parts of ourselves that we can't even imagine are there. And then, like Keila said, we can expand our intimacy with others because we're more authentic. We can get to know ourselves and get to know others in their shadows and have deeper, authentic intimacy with others, family members, partners, friends. We can identify the projections that we're making onto others as we attribute our own shadows onto other people. We go to a party and we say to ourselves, oh God, she's so seductive, or he's so aggressive. And then we don't want to be friends with them because we're in a projection and we don't really know who they are. So we can begin to see the projections that color our relationships. And we can even view the current political and social climate differently through understanding shadow work. We can talk about that. So this is a practice, a contemplative practice, and it's a lens through which to see the world and our relationships. And it's a way to honor ourselves and be accountable to ourselves and others.
Yeah, it's a very important practice. And physically, we see our shadows if we choose to look behind us or besides us, and we can never truly run away from that shape and from that presence. We can only look away, not run away, and it will always be there. So it's a conscious choice to bring more awareness to the full spectrum, the full picture of who you are, and walk hand in hand with it and not try to fight it off or repress it, because it does influence our thoughts, our behaviors. It influences our life, our relationships without us even consciously knowing. So a huge benefit is going and moving through life with that shadow awareness so you're not blindsided by it.
Yeah, so you're not constantly sabotaging yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So when you choose the same wrong partner again and again, it's your shadow erupting. When you procrastinate on your job or your creative projects, it's the shadow sabotaging you. When you struggle with addiction, it's the shadow sabotaging you. Or you have the same fights with your partner over and over, and nobody can figure out how to solve it. It's your shadows boxing with each other.
Yeah. One way to spot your shadow is, like you mentioned, projections and reactions. Strong emotional reactions. Those are two clear places in our life that we can start spotting the shadow. Are there any other places that you would recommend to start
Yes.
with?
Yeah, so we meet the shadow all day long, every day in really small ways that we may not know about. So what you're talking about is a trigger. Let's say we have this really intense emotional reaction to something somebody says to us and we feel triggered. And what does that mean? We slow down, we close down, we want to run away. We feel hurt, rejected, we feel criticized or abandoned, right? So that emotional trigger has so much information in us. It's a coded message about our history, about our hidden needs, about our inability to communicate or our need to communicate. So we can learn how to unravel that trigger. In psychology, we call it a complex. It's a kind of mix of feelings and images and memories, and we can learn to decode it with shadow work.
Yeah, that resonated with the word decoding, seeing it as like a process of decoding your shadow,
Yeah.
unraveling it, and then paying attention to the information, the messages that it has for us, about us.
Yeah. And then we meet the shadow in our dreams every night.
Yeah.
Have you ever noticed that you do something in one of your dreams that you'd never do in your waking life, right? That's a part of you acting out as your shadow,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
Or we talked about projections onto other people. We meet the shadow. We meet the shadow in addictions when our ego can't control our behavior. And we say to ourselves, oh, one more time, I'll never smoke weed again, just tonight. And yet we can't control it because the shadow of the addict takes control of our psyche. And
Yeah.
without shadow work, we don't have a way to wrestle with it.
Right. So let's say you brought in awareness. You're starting to decode your shadow. You come across an aha moment or that piece of information that lights up that dark space. What do you do after that? What is the next step to possibly integrate the shadow, overcome it, or dissolve it? How would you see the after effects of shadow awareness?
Okay. Well, I want to ask you the same question, but I'll go first. So, when you start to notice a pattern that something's happening over and over again, you can take a breath and ask yourself, is this my shadow? I'm criticizing my husband, and I seem to be doing that every few days. Is this my shadow? So, with my method, first you do your centering practice. Maybe you meditate or you pray, you do mindfulness, you do walking meditation, you do something that allows you to turn within and observe your mind, body, your whole mind, body, and watch. That's the first step, is self-observation. And then you notice every time the critic comes up, guess what happens? The same inner dialogue. You say to yourself, oh, I can't stand it when he does XYZ. The same feelings. I feel disgusted. I feel sad. I feel distant. The same bodily sensations. Your shoulders get tight, your belly gets queasy. So then you have three cues that the shadow character is around, and you give it a name, the critic, and you give it an image. Let's say for the critic, it's a finger pointing blame. You're shaking your finger. So now, the next time that shadow character emerges, you can catch it. You have a second in which to identify this is the critic. I'm saying the same thing to myself. I'm feeling the same feelings. And what are the consequences if I speak it out loud? My husband shuts down and withdraws. Is that what I want? What I really want is more connection, right? So let me take a breath and slow down the process and ask myself, where did this come from in my history? And part of it is tracing it back to understand the origins of the critic. And do I want the consequences of speaking out the critic, which is more distance? Well, maybe I want some space. Maybe the critic is unconsciously making distance because I can't consciously say, I need some time to myself. So there's a valid need inside the critic, but it's taking action in a harmful way. So how could you consciously, intentionally take your space? You could say to your husband or your wife or your friend or your mother, I'm going to be alone today. I need some space. And that way, the need inside the critic gets met, but the consequences of the shadow don't follow.
That is a beautiful explanation. I was really in my head boiling it down to, yes, bringing awareness, identifying the pattern, coming to that space of understanding with yourself, and then identifying what the need is. Like there's a deeper need here that's not being met. And because of that, there's a gap between your current self and your desired state of self, which is a more radiant you, a more whole you, a more happy you. And so you can't bridge the need with external factors because that's not going to fulfill you intrinsically. And shadow work is all about that intrinsic perception, that intrinsic work that we do on ourselves. So we can become our own source of healing. And by asking yourself, what do I need? If it's space, if it's to go out in nature, if it's to have a difficult conversation and get something off of your chest that you're holding back, whatever the need is, taking action towards giving yourself that with grace. And there's a lot of different techniques that could look like. Mirror work is something that I love to do personally. So, really sitting with myself and then having a dialogue and engaging with that shadow character that's alive and sitting with it, because the shadow fragments us. And in doing shadow work, we can put ourselves back together. Even if it's not going to look like a perfect picture, it's still going to feel connected. So it's a practice of reconnecting what is
Yes.
connected.
And these parts are typically very young. They formed early in our lives. And so now we have an adult part that can actually take care of that younger part's need. So as you were saying, if we can draw on our inner resources to meet those needs consciously, we may not need to act out the shadow part after a while.
Yeah.
So, we also meet the shadow in our moods, in our feelings that get intractable. For example, if it's depression or anxiety, there's a shadow character in there that is grasping your psyche, gripping it, and then you unconsciously identify with it. But that mood is a part, it's not who you are, it's not your spiritual nature. Whatever we call that, we could call it our essence or spirit or Buddha nature or our Christ nature or pure consciousness. That mood that you struggle with, the depression, the anxiety, is not who you really are. And so if you can begin to isolate it as a part and identify it as a shadow, you can separate from it. You'll start to make it a third. Oh, I see it out there. That's my anxiety, anxious Susie. That's not me. It's not who I am. And you can begin to dialogue with it. And as you said, talk to it in the mirror or write about it in the journal. And then you're less identified with it. And the other person mentioned, adapting to our families. And that's just a theme in shadow work that is constant because the way the shadows form is exactly about adapting to our families. Do you want to talk about that? All of us have to adapt to get love and approval. This process of the ego and the shadow forming early in our lives is the story of how we become who we are. Some of it may be inherent and genetic and biological, but a lot of it is shaped by our family dynamics. And when you start to recognize that, it can be shocking. Like this woman said, she's seeing it in her dreams. It can be shocking when you first recognize that. And the whole field of psychology is kind of rooted in that idea. And when you begin to do shadow work or you begin psychotherapy, you can begin to heal some of that family dynamic that you're still carrying with you.
So we've been addressing the individual shadow, and I want to introduce the concept of the collective shadow. And that's what happens when a society externalizes all of its fears and wounds and insecurities and projects them on as an enemy. So it's the oldest psychological defense. If I'm not willing to face what's uncomfortable in me, then I'll find someone else to carry it for me. And that has perpetuated a lot of societal and collective shadows.
Yeah. So our personal shadow is kind of nested in our family shadow, right? And your family has a persona that says you're a good Christian, upright family, or you're a liberal, Jewish, educated family. And that family persona has its shadows. In some cases, there's abuse going on underneath that persona, or there's cheating going on, or there's more subtle feelings, behaviors that are going on. And that family shadow is nested in a community shadow. Let's say a church community, or a neighborhood, or a spiritual community, or a university community, right? And those all have a persona, a presentation to the world, right? We've been watching Harvard struggle with the attack on its persona and its shadow. And those communities are nested in the national shadow. It's like Russian dolls nested in each other. So there's a lot of shadow for the United States in our history of slavery and genocide and all the things we don't talk about in our, national persona, that we're the greatest, but we're hiding from or denying a lot of the shadow issues in our own history. So what we see going on now, as you say, is collective shadow projection, in which whole groups or countries, could be groups like political groups that are polarized, or religious groups that say, we're right and everybody else is an infidel going to hell, or countries. We've had, Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Palestine, and now Iran, and all rooted in shadow projection that the other is the enemy, and therefore we dehumanize them and we can do whatever we want to them. We can commit murder and genocide because they don't matter. So shadow projection is the root of so many of our issues, Keila. It's the root of sexism. It's the root of racism, ageism, anti-immigrant hatred, homophobia, transphobia. It's all about projecting onto the other what's unacceptable to us, and then turning the other into subhuman, so they can have no rights. What is happening now with trans people, for example, their rights don't matter, or immigrants. And the persecution that's happening now, it's rooted in shadow projection. So we're at this moment, this particular historical, cultural moment, in which it's really important for each of us to do our own shadow work as a social and political responsibility, because we don't want to be adding to the darkness and the hate and the anger, right? We want to be adding to the light. We want to be adding to awareness. And that's really the reason you and I are doing this today.
Yeah, we're watching it happen in real time right now in the current US government. And we're like prioritizing retribution over restoration, and revenge is normalized. Compassion dies when that happens.
Yes.
Fear is politicized and projected and becomes a strategy. So the shadow in that sense becomes a great weapon to create tension and dualities in our societies, where inside nations we're fighting with each other, and that disrupts the potential of peace and understanding and union. There's a lot of disunion, and we no longer see each other as human, and we suck the human perspective out because there's all this logic and beliefs and the way systems work, and a lot of unjust behavior.
Yes. So shadow projection is being weaponized, and it's become contagious. whole groups of many, many millions of people are now caught in these projections around the world, in our country and in other countries, and making enemies rapidly. So it's really important that each of us participate consciously in working with the dark side of human nature and cultivating our own shadow awareness and bringing our own light.
And a way we can start doing that independent work is by asking ourselves questions like, what am I stereotyping? What am I feeding into this collective shadow? What have I labeled as the problem?
Where is my rage coming from?
Mm.
Right? Where is my hate coming from? And what are the consequences of those shadow parts leaking out into the world by tens of millions of people? So, how can I be accountable? Because, there are valid reasons for anger right now, and there are valid reasons for grief. And we can have authentic, difficult emotions. But what's different is if they're outside of awareness in the shadow and they're projected out and disowned within, then we're contributing to the problem and not the solution.
Yeah, collective healing begins when enough of us learn how to take responsibility for the stories that we've inherited, that we've been born into, and the unconscious biases that we carry forward in thought and in behavior. It takes time and patience, but that's why we're here, to bring that awareness and to create the space and the opportunity for everyone to take accountability.
So we hope you'll join us in this journey of healing and reconciliation and shadow awareness, whether you do it by reading books or talking with your friends or writing in your journal or watching our Substack videos, however you choose to explore, or finding a therapist, however you choose to explore your shadow and tell people about it and share your insights is beautiful, and it's a contribution.
It is. Thanks, Dr. Connie.
Thank you, Keila.
And this was nice. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Find us on Substack and join our community chat, where we'll share these interviews and exclusive insights and prompts and have a more intimate conversation with everyone on there. We appreciate you joining.
Bye-bye.